I signed up for an alien exchange program. Now my roommate is in love with me. Welcome to the world of science fiction. Comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Jason Ward never thought an interstellar university would feel this normal. The place was massive, a sprawling city of glass towers and floating walkways, with students from 100 different species walking, floating, or skittering past him. Some wore gravity harnesses, some shimmered out of phase with reality, and others had multiple limbs or bioluminescent skin. He had prepared for culture shock, but standing in the middle of the bustling campus, bag slung over his shoulder, trying not to stare too hard at the six-sided reptilian creature haggling over a vending machine snack, he realized no amount of study could have truly prepared him for this. He adjusted the digital badge pin to his chest, which pulsed with his assigned dormitory location, Building 47, a room 421, his new home for the year. A deep breath settled him as he moved forward, dodging a trio of levitating students engaged in a heated debate about quantum linguistics. He kept his head down, determined to make a good first impression. After all, he was representing Earth in the exchange program, and the last thing he needed was to be labeled as the awkward human who couldn't even handle basic intergalactic etiquette. His roommate, whoever they were, would probably already have enough preconceived notions about him. He needed to prove he wasn't some clueless primitive from a backwater planet. The dormitory was surprisingly sleek, tall, curved structures that gleamed under the twin moons. The inside was a strange mix of familiar and alien architecture. Hallways wide enough to accommodate species of all shapes and sizes, with floating signs adjusting their script to whatever language the viewer spoke. Jason door unlocked with a low chime as he approached, scanning his badge before sliding open to reveal his living space. It was surprisingly spacious, though clearly designed to house two species with wildly different needs. The room was split down the middle. One side held a standard human bed, a desk, and a closet, while the other was more exotic. A raised cushion platform, covered in dark velvet-like material, sat in the corner, surrounded by what looked like hanging silk drapes, giving it a more enclosed, den-like feel. The walls on that side were textured, marked with faint glowing patterns that pulsed rhythmically, almost like a living heartbeat. Jason barely had time to take it in before he heard a sound behind him. A soft, almost melodic hum, followed by the light shuffle of footsteps. He turned, eyes widening, as he got his first look at his roommate. She was unexpected. He had braced himself for something truly alien, an amorphous blob, a creature with exoskeletons and mandibles, maybe even a tentacled life form that communicated through color shifts. Instead, he found himself staring at a tall, blue-skinned woman with large silver eyes that studied him with equal parts curiosity and wariness. Her long dark hair cascaded down her back in soft waves, framing delicate, almost feline features. She moved with an effortless grace, bare feet barely making a sound against the smooth floor, and behind her a fluffy cat-like tail twitched, slightly curling and uncurling, as if reacting to some unspoken thought. He opened his mouth to introduce himself, but she beat him to it, her voice smooth but carrying an edge of authority. "You're the human," she said, stating it as a fact rather than a question. Jason blinked, caught off guard by the bluntness of the greeting. Yeah, Jason Ward." He extended a hand out of instinct, before remembering that handshakes weren't universal. He awkwardly pulled it back, stuffing it into his pocket. "You must be Sylari." Her gaze flicked to his retracted hand before returning to his face. Unreadable, yes. Silence stretched between them, thick and slightly uncomfortable. Jason cleared his throat, shifting his bag to his other shoulder. "So this is going to be interesting. I mean, cross-species dorm arrangements are probably meant to encourage cooperation, right?" He chuckled, trying to break the tension, but Sylari didn't react. She tilted her head slightly, those silver eyes studying him with unnerving intensity, before she finally spoke again. "Just don't touch my things." That wasn't exactly the warmest welcome, but Jason decided not to push it. "Got it, I like my personal space too." Another pause, then without another word, Sylari turned and walked toward her side of the room, settling onto her cushioned platform. With ease she curled her legs beneath her, reaching for a small floating tablet-like device, her tail flicking once before curling around her waist like a protective shield. Jason sighed, running a hand through his hair. Well, that could have gone worse. He set his bag down, taking a moment to absorb the reality of the situation. His roommate was gorgeous, vaguely cat-like, and probably already regretting having to share a space with him. This was going to be a long year. Still, it could be worse. At least she wasn't trying to eat him. The next few days were a blur of orientation meetings, technology adjustments, and social minefields. Jason learned quickly that while most students were open-minded, there was a strict divide between species when it came to relationships. The Intergalactic Cultural Preservation Act, a rule enforced by the university, explicitly forbade cross-species romance, claiming it was for the protection of both cultural identity and biological integrity. Some students followed the rule out of tradition, others out of fear of the consequences. The punishment was severe expulsion, deportation, and in some cases memory modification. Jason didn't plan on breaking the rule, but it still felt weirdly archaic. After all, if so many species had evolved together, shouldn't relationships naturally form? He wasn't about to test the system, though he had one job: to learn to experience, and to not get kicked out of the best intergalactic school in existence. Sylari, on the other hand, remained an enigma. She wasn't cold exactly, but she kept her distance. Their conversations were short, usually limited to polite necessities. Jason caught her watching him sometimes, though she always looked away when he noticed her tail, however, was a dead giveaway. It would twitch whenever he spoke to another female student, something he found both strange and oddly fascinating. At first he assumed it was just a natural reflex, but when another human exchange student laughed a little too loudly at one of his jokes, he felt something soft and warm wrap around his wrist. Sylari's tail. He glanced down, startled. She didn't seem to realize she was doing it, her expression neutral as she scrolled through her tablet. Jason cleared his throat. Sylari, she blinked, glancing at him, then at her own tail, still looped around his wrist. A beat of silence, then her tail snapped back like she had been burned. Sailor's expression didn't change, but Jason swore he saw the faintest hint of a blush beneath her sapphire blue skin. She turned away sharply, her voice cool but hurried. It was an accident. Jason smirked. He wasn't so sure about that. Jason tried not to think too much about what had happened with Sailor's tail, but the moment replayed in his head more times than he wanted to admit. He told himself it was nothing, just an instinctive reaction, maybe even a biological quirk of her species. But the way she had pulled back, her usually composed expression faltering for just a second, made it hard to shake the feeling that it meant something more. He didn't press the issue, though she clearly didn't want to talk about it. And considering they were barely getting along, as it was pushing her now seemed like a bad idea. Instead, he focused on settling into universal life, trying to get a handle on classes, campus customs, and the ever-present reality that he was one of the few humans in a place filled with beings far more advanced than him. The academic side of things was a mixed bag. Some classes were fascinating, like xenopsychology, where he got to study how different species processed emotions, memory, and perception. Others were downright brutal, like quantum linguistics, which made his brain feel like it was being stretched into another dimension every time the professor explained a new grammatical structure that only existed in phase time species. The technology at Vale and Prime made Earth's advancements look laughable, with floating holographic displays, real-time knowledge injections, and instantaneous neural downloads for students whose biology could handle them. Unfortunately for Jason, humans weren't compatible with half of the university's learning aids, so he had to do things the old-fashioned way, reading, memorizing, and hopping. He wasn't falling behind socially. Things weren't any easier. Most students were polite but distant, as if still deciding whether humans were worth their time. The few other humans in the exchange program stuck together when they could, but they were scattered across different dorms and departments, making it difficult to form a solid group. Herrera was the only one he saw regularly, mostly because they had a couple of classes together, and she was one of the few people who didn't make him feel like an awkward outsider. She was easy to talk to, sharp-witted, and had a knack for making even the most intimidating alien professors seem less terrifying. Jason appreciated having a familiar face in the crowd, even if he noticed Sailor's tail twitching every time he sat with Aurora in the dining hall or studied with her in the common area. He didn't mention it, but he caught the way Sailor's ears flicked ever so slightly when Aurora laughed too loudly at something he said, or how her silver eyes lingered on them for a fraction longer than necessary before she returned to whatever she was working on. Despite her initial coldness, living with Sylari was surprisingly easy. She was neat, efficient, and didn't fill the room with awkward small talk. If anything, she was too quiet, always watching, always calculating. Jason wasn't sure what she thought of him, but she was an outright hostile, which he took as a win. She had a habit of staying up late, stretched out on her platform, scrolling through dense academic texts, or reading what looked like political reports. He wasn't sure what she was studying, but from the occasional sharp glances at her communicator, he guessed it wasn't just regular coursework. Every now and then he'd hear her mutter something in her native tongue, her tail flicking in agitation before she'd sigh and refocus. He wanted to ask, but their unspoken agreement seemed to be don't pry, don't push, just exist. It worked well enough that changed the night. Walked in on VES. Jason had just finished a long day of classes and was looking forward to crashing in his bed, but the moment he stepped into the room he knew something was off. Sylari was standing near her side of the room, arms crossed, her entire posture stiff and unyielding. Across from her stood a man, tall, broad-shouldered, and distinctly from her species, though with darker slate blue skin and piercing violet eyes that carried a confidence bordering on arrogance. His attire was far, far too formal for a student. His long, high-collared coat embroidered with symbols Jason didn't recognize, but the way he held himself back, straight chin tilted slightly downward, made it clear he was someone important. Jason stopped short, gripping the strap of his bag. He hadn't expected company from the look on Sailor's face. Neither had she. The man V's, as Jason would soon learn, cast him a slow, mead look, his expression shifting into something unreadable before turning back to Sylari. This is your human. Jason bristled at the wording, but before he could say anything, Sylari exhaled sharply through her nose. He is my roommate, she corrected, her voice edged with irritation. VY smirked, as if that answer amused him. He took a step closer to Sylari, clearly unfazed by her hostility. Strange. I had expected you to at least request someone more compatible. Jason had no idea what the hell that was supposed to mean, but the dismissive tone in Vez's voice was enough to make his jaw tight before he could speak. Sylari took an almost imperceptible step in front of him, positioning herself between him and VVS. This conversation is unnecessary, she said, her voice clipped. You know my stance. VES tilted his head, looking her over with a gaze that sent every alarm in Jason's brain ringing. There was a familiarity there, an expectation that made Jason's stomach churn. This wasn't some random encounter. These two knew each other. Jason didn't know what to say, but his silence didn't matter because Veli turned his attention back to him, his violet eyes narrowing slightly. Do you even understand what you're involved in, human? Jason frowned. Involved in what? VY chuckled, the sound low and condescending. Of course you don't know. He shifted his gaze back to Sylari, shaking his head. I would have expected better from you. Surely this arrangement is beneath you. Sailor's hands curled into fists at her sides. You don't get to decide what it is or isn't beneath me. There was a challenge in her voice, and for a brief moment VY seemed to consider pushing further, but then he sighed, shaking his head, as if he were almost disappointed. Very well, he murmured, stepping back. But I do wonder how long you plan to keep pretending none of this matters. With that, he turned, his long coat swirling around him as he strode toward the door. As he passed Jason, he gave him one last unreadable look before walking out without another word. The moment the door slid shut behind him, the tension in the room snapped like a stretched wire. Jason exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. So what the hell was that about? Sylari didn't answer immediately. Her shoulders were still rigid, her tail flicking in erratic movements that betrayed whatever she was feeling. Finally, after a long pause, she sighed and walked over to her bed. sinking down with a weariness Jason hadn't seen from her before. "Nothing that concerns you," she said, but there was something in her tone, something unsteady, something that said she didn't quite believe her own words. Jason sat on his own bed watching her for a long moment. Before leaning back against the wall, "Yeah," he muttered. "I don't believe that Sylari didn't look at him, but she also didn't tell him he was wrong." Jason didn't sleep well that night. His mind kept circling back to VY, to the tension in Sari's shoulders, to the way she had positioned herself between them without even realizing it. There was history there, something deeper than just a casual acquaintance, and the way V's had spoken to him with that smirking arrogance made Jason's stomach twist in a way he didn't like. He wasn't stupid. He had seen this kind of thing before. VY hadn't been asking questions, he had been staking a claim, and the worst part, Sylari hadn't denied it. She hadn't snapped back with her usual sharp wit, hadn't called him delusional or scoffed at the idea outright. She had just stood there tense and unreadable, and that silence had said more than anything else. By the time morning arrived, Jason had barely managed a few hours of sleep, and his mood was as sour as the strange citrus-like juice he had grabbed from the dining hall. Sylari was already awake when he left for class, silent and withdrawn, her silver eyes locked on her tablet as if it contained the answers to the universe. She didn't acknowledge him when he walked past, and for once he didn't feel like trying to force a conversation. Whatever was going on, she clearly wasn't ready to talk about it. And if she wanted to pretend last night never happened, fine. He had enough to deal with without getting sucked into whatever complicated web she was tangled in. Classes were a blur of incomprehensible alien concepts and barely contained exhaustion, and by the time he made it to the library to meet Sylari, he was running on nothing but stubbornness and a questionable amount of caffeine. She had already claimed a table near one of the wide FL ceiling windows, her human features standing out starkly against the backdrop of the countless alien students around her. She grinned when she saw him judging a data pad toward him as he dropped into the seat across from her. "You look like you got run over by a grav car," she observed, propping her chin on her hand. "Rough night," Jason exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "You have no idea." Laura arched a brow, tilting her head slightly. "Sylari still being weirder," he muttered, dragging the datapad closer and pretending to skim the notes she had pulled up for their xenopsychology assignment. "Some guy show up last night, V-boy." She knew him, and let's just say he wasn't thrilled about me being there. Alara's expression shifted, curiosity flashing in her dark eyes. "VY, as in Vice?" Caro. Jason paused, narrowing his eyes. "I don't know his last name." He was tall, kind of intense, and looked at me like I was a stain on his boot. Aurora let out a low whistle, leaning back in her seat. "Yeah, that sounds like him. He's kind of a big deal. His family is one of the oldest ruling houses on Vale and Prime, like royalty adjacent." "Big deal." That didn't sit well. Jason frowned, turning her words over in his head. "And he and Sylari." Alara gave him a knowing look. "If he was showing up at your dorm unannounced, he probably thinks she's his, or at least she was supposed to be." Jason ran a hand through his hair, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. He didn't like that. Sylari had a past she clearly wasn't sharing. Didn't like that. VY thought he had some kind of claim over her. More than anything, he hated the way the whole situation left him feeling unsettled, like he was missing something important. But before he could dwell on it, a voice cut through the low murmur of the library, sharp and accented. Jason Ward, his entire body went rigid before he even looked up. "Sailor." She stood a few feet away, arms crossed, tail flicking behind her in that way that meant she was either irritated or uncomfortable. Maybe both. Her silver eyes flicked to Aura for a fraction of a second before settling on him, unreadable and guarded. Jason set the data pad down, exhaling slowly. "Yeah, we need to talk." There was no question in her voice, no room for argument. Aura glanced between them, lips twitching in amusement before she held up her hands in mock surrender. "Right, that's my cue to leave. Try not to kill each other." Jason ignored her as she slid away, watching as Sylari hesitated for the briefest moment before sitting down across from him, her usual composure thinner than usual. Neither of them spoke for a long beat, tension stretching between them like an invisible wire. Finally, Sylari exhaled, her voice lower than usual. When she finally spoke, "I assume you have questions." Jason leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. "You think?" She didn't rise to the bait, her silver eyes locking onto his with that unwavering intensity that always made it impossible to look away. "This is nothing you need to concern yourself with," he scoffed, shaking his head. "See, that's funny, because when a guy shows up in my room and acts like I shouldn't be there, I tend to take that personally." Her jaw tightened slightly, but her expression remained neutral. "It's complicated." Jason let out a dry, leaning back in his chair. "Yeah, no kidding." Sylari exhaled slowly, as if choosing her words carefully, which only made him more suspicious. "And I were once aligned." Jason's stomach clenched, and he wasn't entirely sure why. "Aligned?" he repeated. "That's a nice, vague way of saying we were together." Something flickered across her face, but it was gone before he could decipher it. It was never that simple. "His family and mine have long-standing political ties." Before anyone can suppress it, Jason exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "You're saying I should walk into a disciplinary hearing and throw this in their faces?" Lyon nodded. "Precisely." Jason let out a dry laugh. "Fantastic. That won't paint a target on my back at all." Sylari finally spoke, her voice steady. "Vise already sees you as a target. You might as well make it count." Jason met her gaze, something spoken passing between them. She was right, of course. Backing down wasn't an option anymore. "All right," he muttered, "let's do it." The hearing was scheduled faster than Jason expected. By the time he and Sylari entered the grand hall designated for academic proceedings, there was already a low buzz of conversation from the assembled faculty and student representatives. Word had spread quickly. Jason could feel it in the way people whispered as he walked past, in the curious and skeptical glances shot in his direction. He wasn't just a human exchange student caught in a bureaucratic mess anymore. He was a disruption. Was already there, seated at the opposite end of the chamber, his expression perfectly composed, as if this was all a minor inconvenience rather than a direct challenge to his influence. He barely acknowledged Jason, instead keeping his focus on the administrative panel overseeing the proceedings. The lead official, a tall, willowy being with metallic skin and deep-set eyes, addressed the chamber in a smooth, measured voice. "Jason Ward, you stand accused of violating the terms of your exchange agreement by interfering in administrative governance and disrupting the preservation of cultural directives. Do you have anything to present in your defense before the committee reaches its ruling?" Jason stepped forward, forcing his expression into one of calm confidence rather than the barely restrained frustration simmering beneath his skin. He activated his communicator, and the dossier Sylari had gathered appeared in a hovering projection, the glowing files shifting as they arranged themselves in clear, damning sequence. "With all due respect," Jason said, keeping his tone steady, "I'd argue that my presence here isn't the real issue." He gestured toward the projection. Carvo has systematically manipulated university policy to silence dissent and remove those who challenge his influence. The charges against me are just another example of that." A ripple of murmur spread through the hall. The panel members exchanged unreadable glances, but Jason didn't look away, didn't back down. However, remained stone-faced, his expression betraying nothing. But Jason knew he had struck a nerve. One of the officials cleared their throat, their gaze shifting toward V's. "These are serious allegations, Lord Carvo. Do you wish to respond?" Finally stood, his expression calm, almost bored. "There is no need to waste time entertaining baseless accusations." He glanced at Jason, a thin, unimpressed smile curling at the corner of his lips. "But I do admire your persistence." Jason clenched his fists at his sides, but before he could respond, Sylari stepped forward, her silver eyes locked onto V's with a quiet intensity that sent a ripple through the room. "Baseless," she repeated softly. "Then you won't mind if the committee investigates further?" V's smile faltered just for a second, but Jason saw it, and he knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The moment stretched thick with tension As the council chamber hung in stunned silence, eyes shifting between Jason Sylari and VES, Jason could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, the stakes having escalated far beyond what he had expected when he first arrived at this university. This wasn't just about his exchange program status anymore. This was about power, control, and the breaking of long-held structures designed to keep people in check. VY held himself perfectly still, his violet eyes sharp but unreadable, his practiced noble demeanor still firmly in place. But Jason had seen it, the brief flicker of uncertainty, the tiniest shift in his carefully constructed mask. VY hadn't expected resistance at this level, hadn't counted on someone standing in direct opposition to his influence in a public setting, or he couldn't twist the narrative without scrutiny. The lead official's voice finally cut through the charged silence. Lady Verth, your proposal suggests a full inquiry into Lord Caro's conduct within university affairs. That is a considerable accusation. Sylari stood tall, unshaken. Then I assumed Lord Carvo will have no objection if the inquiry proves him innocent. Her voice was smooth, controlled, but Jason could hear the steel underneath. A murmur spread through the gathered officials and students, some shifting uncomfortably. Vi's influence was undeniable, but Sylari was no small something back. By the time he returned to the dorm that night, he had resolved to let it go. If she wanted to tell him more, she would. If not, it wasn't his place to force the issue. He had enough on his plate without getting tangled in whatever political mess she was trying to outrun. But the moment he stepped into the room, he knew something was off. Sylari was sitting on her bed, her tail curled tightly around her waist, her expression unreadable. But it wasn't just that there was something in the air, tension, a static charge that made the small hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. He set his bag down carefully, watching her. What happened? He asked. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned her tablet toward him. And the moment he saw the screen, his stomach dropped. It was a message from VES, and it wasn't subtle. You should choose your company more wisely, Sylari. The human is inconvenient, but I am patient. Jason clenched his jaw, his hands curling into fists before he forced himself to relax. Well, that's not creepy at all. Sylari exhaled, shutting the tablet off. I told you, he will not make things easy. Jason dragged a hand through his hair, packing for a moment before turning back to her. So what do we do? Sylari blinked, clearly not expecting the we. Jason sighed. Look, I get it. This isn't my fight. But VY seems to think it is, which means ignoring him isn't going to work. So what's the move here? Sylari studied him for a long moment before finally slowly speaking. There is a group of students who believe the university's rules on interspecies relationships are outdated. They work in secret. If VES escalates, they may be our only option. Jason frowned. Wait, what do you mean if he escalates? Sylari hesitated before finally saying VES does not threaten. Idly, Jason exhaled, shaking his head. Great, fantastic, love that for us sailors. Lips twitched just barely before she sobered again. I will handle this. Jason met her gaze, holding it. Not alone. Something flickered in her expression. Annoyance maybe, or something else entirely. But she didn't argue, and that Jason thought was probably the closest thing to trust he was going to get for now. Jason had never considered himself the type to get caught up in secret underground movements. But here he was standing in the shadowed corner of a dimly lit atrium beneath the university's lower levels, waiting for someone Sylari insisted could help them. The place was eerily silent compared to the vibrant chaos of the main campus, and the walls had a faint bioluminescent glow, casting soft pulses of blue and green light that made the shadows dance. It didn't feel abandoned, but it wasn't exactly welcoming either. The whole situation felt like the start of a bad decision. But at this point, what other choice did he have? Sylari had been tense ever since their conversation in the dorm, her usual guarded composure cracking just enough for him to see how much Vez's message had rattled her. She wouldn't admit it, of course. She would rather chew glass than show weakness. But Jason wasn't blind. She was worried. And when Sylari was worried, that meant things were worse than she was letting on. Now, as she stood beside him, arms crossed, silver eyes scanning the space with sharp precision, Jason could feel the weight of her sill pressing down on him. He wanted to ask what they were walking into, But she had already been frustratingly vague about the whole thing. The silver thread, as she had called them, was more than just a group of students grumbling about unfair university policies. They were active dissenters pushing back against the administration's outdated stance on interspecies relationships, and apparently they had access to information that could help them deal with VES before things got any worse. Jason wasn't sure how he felt about it. He hadn't come here to get involved in some grand political struggle. He just wanted to survive the year without making an intergalactic fool of himself. But VY had made it clear that ignoring the problem wasn't an option. And if Jason had learned anything about himself over the years, it was that he wasn't very good at backing down when someone tried to push him into a corner. A soft clicking sound broke the silence, and Jason tensed, instinctively shifting his weight as his eyes flicked toward the source of the noise. A doorway that had been seamlessly camouflaged into the far wall slid open with a low hiss, revealing a tall figure stepping into the faint glow of the atrium. Jason immediately knew they weren't human. Their elongated limbs and translucent skin shimmered under the lights, and their eyes, a swirling mixture of shifting colors, lacked any visible pupils. They moved with an unsettling grace, their long coat flowing around them, as if caught in a non-existent breeze. Sylari Verth. The figure greeted their voice, a mixture of tones, as if multiple speakers were layered on top of one another. I had a feeling you would come. Jason shot a glance at Sylari, his stomach twisting slightly at the way the figure had said her name, not with surprise, but with familiarity. Sylari inclined her head, her posture still rigid. You're well informed. As always, the figure's swirling G shifted to Jason, and though they had no pupils, he could feel them assessing him. It wasn't hostile, but it was unnerving. And you've brought a guest, Jason Ward. Sailor's voice didn't betray any emotion. He is involved now, whether he wants to be or not. Jason exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. Yeah, I've noticed. The figure studied him for another long moment before nodding slightly. I am Lion. I oversee most of the silver threads operation on campus. Their voice carried a strange cadence, as if they were speaking just slightly out of sync with normal time. You are here because of V's Carvo. Sailor's tail flicked slightly behind her, a small involuntary movement Jason had come to recognize as restrained irritation. He's already trying to assert control over my choices. I need leverage before he decides to escalate further. Lion hummed, the sound vibrating unnaturally in Jason's ears. And what makes you think we have that leverage? Sylari's silver eyes narrowed slightly. You wouldn't have let us through that door if you didn't. Lion's lips curved just barely at that, amusement flickering in their expression. Fair enough. They gestured toward the passage they had come from, stepping aside. Then come inside. We have much to discuss. Jason followed Sylari through the entrance, stepping into a hidden network of chambers buried beneath the university. The space was far more advanced than he had expected. Holographic interfaces lined the walls, and groups of students from different species were engaged in quiet but intense discussions. This wasn't some amateur resistance group. This was something else entirely. Lion led them deeper into the underground complex, stopping in front of a large display projecting rotating images of various students and faculty members. Jason recognized some of them: professor, profs, council members, influential students, but it was the name VY Carvo that stood out, his image hovering beside a long string of data written in a language Jason couldn't read. We've been tracking Vi's movements for some time, Lion said, gesturing toward the screen. Not because of you specifically, but because he has ties to factions beyond this university. His family's influence runs deep, and their goals do not align with peaceful academic pursuits. Jason frowned. What does that mean? Lion turned to face him fully, their expression unreadable. It means that VDS is not just some arrogant noble with an outdated claim. His presence here is deliberate. He is not just monitoring Sylari. He is laying the groundwork for something much larger. Sailor's expression didn't change, but Jason could feel the shift in the air. She had suspected something, but she hadn't known the full extent of it. What does he want? She asked. Lion exhaled slowly. That is the question we are still answering. But we do know this: he will not let you go, Sylari, not because of love, not because of honor, but because you are valuable and men like VES do not give up valuable things easily. Jason clenched his jaw, the weight of the words settling over him. This wasn't just about some spoiled noble feeling entitled to Sailor's presence. This was bigger than that, and if they didn't do something soon it was going to get worse. Sylari was quiet for a long moment, before finally saying, "Then I suppose it's time we stop playing defense land." Smiled just barely. "Now you're thinking like us," Jason exhaled, shaking his head. "Great love where this is going." Sylari shot him a dry look. "You didn't have to come." Jason gave her a flat stare. "Yeah, well, too late for that now." Aurora's lips twitched just slightly, not quite a smile but close, and despite everything, the danger, the uncertainty, the chaos that was bound to come, Jason had the strangest feeling that this was exactly where he was meant to be. Jason wasn't sure when his life had turned into some kind of intergalactic conspiracy thriller, but standing in the hidden base of an underground student movement while discussing ways to undermine an arrogant noble with shadowy ambitions definitely wasn't part of his original plan when he signed up for the exchange program. Yet here he was, shoulder to shoulder with Sylari, staring at a holographic display filled with disturbing details about VY and his family's reach. It was worse than he had thought. VY wasn't just some jealous ex clinging to an outdated claim. He was connected to factions far beyond the university, and if what Lion said was true, he was actively working towards something much bigger than harassing Sylari. Jason shifted his weight, crossing his arms as he let the reality of it sink in. He was still processing the fact that the silver thread even existed, let alone that Sylari had apparently known about them long before she had decided to bring him in. He wasn't surprised. She was leaned forward slightly, his tone carrying an air of reluctant agreement. "Provost Drin raises an important point. Our traditions, our legacies, they are what keep us strong. We welcome the exchange of knowledge, but we must be mindful of the consequence of eroding our cultural foundations." It was subtle, almost unnoticeable, but Jason saw the way Sylari stiffened beside him, her silver eyes narrowing just slightly. He wasn't going to sit here and let VY dictate the conversation unchallenged. That was after all why Lion had wanted him here in the first place. Jason shifted forward, making sure his voice carried just enough to be heard without seeming too aggressive. "That's an in perspective. But wouldn't you say that cultural preservation and isolation are two very different things?" A ripple of attention moved through the chamber. VY turned to him slowly, his expression unreadable. "I would of course agree with that distinction, but I fail to see how it applies to this discussion." Jason kept his tone even. "Well, if the goal is to preserve culture, wouldn't the best way to do that be through open dialogue, understanding rather than restriction? I mean, from what I've seen, the university prides itself on bringing together some of the best minds in the galaxy. Isn't the whole point of an exchange program to bridge gaps, not reinforce them?" VY smiled, but it wasn't a friendly one. It was the polished smile of a noble who had spent years learning how to gut someone with words. "An excellent observation, but you are perhaps misunderstanding the concern. There is a difference between cultural exchange and cultural dilution. Some lines should not be crossed." Jason didn't blink. "And who decides where that line is?" The chamber had gone noticeably quieter now, more than a few members paying attention to the exchange. Even Provost Drin, who had previously seemed indifferent, was watching with mild interest. VY exhaled, as if indulging someone who didn't understand how the world worked. "Jason Ward, you are new to this institution and to our ways. We do not fault you for that, but there are things that cannot be explained in a single discussion." Jason shrugged. "I don't know. Seems pretty simple to me. Either people have the right to choose who they associate with, or they don't." A few murmurs flickered through the chamber. VY's expression barely shifted, but Jason caught the faintest flicker of irritation in his eyes. "Sylari chose that moment to speak." Her voice smooth but firm. VY, what Jason is asking, what many of us are wondering, is simple. Why is control so necessary? Why is the university so concerned with restricting relationships rather than fostering them? VY turned to her, his gaze cooling slightly. "You of all people should understand the importance of maintaining order." Sylari tilted her head slightly, her silver eyes glinting with something Jason recognized, not just defiance, but amusement. She was playing him now, and she knew it. "Oh, I do, but order and control are not the same thing." There was another ripple of murmured conversation, and Jason could see the small but significant shift in the room. VES had come into this meeting expecting to set the terms of the discussion, but Jason and Sylari had done something unexpected. They had planted doubt. Vi's expression remained calm, but Jason saw the way his fingers curled slightly on the table before he relaxed them again. He wasn't pleased, even if he wouldn't admit it. The discussion continued, but Jason could already tell they had shaken something loose as they left the chamber, walking side by side through the long halls. Sylari finally let out a slow exhale, her tail uncurling slightly. "You did well," she murmured, just loud enough for him to hear. Jason smirked. "I have my moments." She shot him a look, but there was the smallest curve to her lips, something so faint he almost missed it. For the first time since this whole mess started, Jason had the feeling that they weren't just reacting anymore. They were winning. Jason knew the meeting had changed something. The way VES had looked at him before they left, the tightness in his jaw, despite the smooth mask of noble arrogance, told him everything he needed to know. Jason had gotten under his skin, even if only a little. That wasn't a victory, not yet, but it was a start. And yet, even as he and Sylari walked back to the dorm, tension still clung to the air between them, an unspoken awareness that this wasn't over, not even close. Sylari had been quiet since they left the chamber, her silver eyes unreadable as they moved through the glowing campus walkways. The bioluminescent flora flickered faintly as they passed, casting shifting shadows across the smooth, polished ground. Jason waited for her to say something, anything, but she remained silent, her tail coiled tightly around her wrist in a way he was starting to recognize as a subconscious sign of unease. Finally, Jason sighed, rubbing the back of his neck as they reached their dorm entrance. "All right, you going to?" Rubbing his temples. "Okay, level with me. What aren't you telling me?" Sylari didn't stop walking, but her silver eyes flicked to him, unreadable. "What do you mean?" Jason scoffed. "Come on, you've been tense since we walked out of there, more than usual. What's going on?" For a moment he thought she wouldn't answer, but then she exhaled, her voice lower than usual. "If this fails, Jason, the consequences will not fall on you, they will fall on me." Jason frowned. "We make sure it doesn't fail." Sailor's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile, wasn't quite amusement. "You are very confident for someone who has never dealt with VES before." Jason held her gaze. "And you're acting like we've already lost." Sylari was silent for a long moment before finally sighing, shaking her head. "Then let us hope you are right." Jason smirked. "I usually am." Sylari rolled her eyes, but this time there was the faintest hint of something softer in her expression, not quite trust, but close, and for now, that was enough. Jason had never been particularly good at playing politics, but as he stood in the massive council hall of Vane Prime University, surrounded by towering figures of authority and elite students whose names carried weight in more than just academia, he realized just how out of his depth he truly was. The chamber was a marvel of alien architecture, designed to amplify sound without the need for artificial assistance, its walls embedded with shimmering energy veins that pulsed subtly in rhythm, with the voices that filled the space hovering platforms adjusted automatically to accommodate different species, some floating midair for beings that preferred vertical positioning, others reinforced with gravity stabilizers for those with more traditional bipedal forms. It was an arena designed for debate, strategy, and more often than not manipulation, and right in the center of it all, seated with the kind of effortless arrogance that made Jason's blood oil, was Vice Karath. He was positioned near the front, his violet eyes scanning the chamber with the quiet confidence of someone who knew he was in control, someone who was used to bending conversations and people to his will. His formal attire was a calculated choice, subtly reinforcing his noble lineage, the sharp lines of his coat bearing insignias that Jason couldn't decipher but recognized as symbols of rank. The moment Jason had stepped inside, he had felt Vi's gaze settle on him, a brief flicker of acknowledgement before the noble had dismissed him entirely, as if he weren't even worth the consideration. That single glance had irritated Jason more than he wanted to admit. Sylari, standing just beside him, was the exact opposite, poised, but guarded her expression carefully neutral. She had been silent since they arrived, and Jason didn't miss the way her tail remained wrapped around her own wrist, a gesture that had become familiar to him. Now she didn't like being here, didn't like being forced into this position. But she was playing the long game, waiting, watching, calculating. He had no doubt she had already mapped out every potential outcome of this meeting in her head, even as she pretended not to care. Jason, on the other hand, was still figuring out how not to look like he didn't belong here. As the meeting formally began, Jason did his best to follow the discussion, though much of it was wrapped in bureaucratic jargon that made his head hurt. The council members, an assembly of professors, administrators, and high-ranking students from influential families, discussed everything from university funding to interstellar policy alignments. But beneath the surface, Jason could feel the tension that had nothing to do with academics. This wasn't just about education, this was about control, influence, and the power of certain families like Vezzi's, wielded behind closed doors. Caught the first real shift in the conversation when a council member, a tall silver-plated android-like being known as Provost Drin, adjusted their voice synthesizer before speaking. There has been a concerning rise in unauthorized fraternization between exchange students and native students, Dren said, their voice reverberating slightly through the chamber. While cultural integration remains a cornerstone of Vale and Prime's mission, it is imperative that certain boundaries be maintained. We must protect the integrity of our respective species. Jason immediately tensed there. It was the disguised language of control wrapped in polite academic rhetoric. Why? Always 3 steps ahead of everyone else. But the fact that she had only now decided to include him meant things were worse than she had let on. Lion watched them, both with that same unreadable expression, their multi-tone voice eerily calm as they gestured toward the screen. Vez's movements have been monitored for months. He's been establishing connections within the university's administrative body, ensuring that certain rules remain enforced and, more importantly, ensuring that certain people are kept in check. Their swirling pupilless eyes flicked towards Sylari. You are one of those people. Sylari's silver gaze didn't waver, but Jason saw the way her tail curled slightly around her wrist, a movement so subtle that most people wouldn't have caught it. But Jason wasn't most people. Lion continued, tilting their head slightly. You have always been a problem for him, Sylari, not just because you refused his family's arrangement, but because you are influential in ways that extend beyond mere politics. Your name carries weight, and he cannot afford to have you standing on the wrong side of his agenda. Jason exhaled, slowly piecing it together. So what, he's trying to force her into his corner or remove her entirely? Lion said simply. Jason's stomach twisted, but Sailor's expression remained unreadable. He cannot move against me openly, not yet. No, Lion agreed, but he is patient, and he is building leverage, which means it is only a matter of time before he finds a way. Silence settled between them, the weight of it pressing down on Jason's chest. He glanced at Sylari, waiting for her to say something, to come up with one of her carefully calculated plans, but for the first time since he had met her, she looked uncertain. Jason clenched his jaw, shifting his stance. So we make the first move? Sailor's silver eyes snapped to him, sharp with something unspoken, but before she could say anything, Lion let out a soft hum of approval. Now you are thinking strategically. Jason rolled his eyes. Yeah, great, love being strategic. I see. So what does that actually mean? Lion turned back to the holographic display, their long fingers swiping through layers of encrypted information, revealing a complex web of connections. Vez is known allies, his movements over the past few months, and more importantly, potential weaknesses. There is a council meeting in 2 days. Lion said, a formal gathering of the university's administrative board, including several representatives from Vi's faction. Officially, it is to discuss curriculum reforms and exchange program funding. Their lips curved slightly. Unofficially, it is an opportunity for certain individuals to push their agendas forward in a way that cannot be easily opposed. Sailor's expression darkened slightly. And you believe VES intends to use this as a way to consolidate more power? Lion nodded. It is a strong possibility. Their gaze flicked to Jason. And you are now a variable in his calculations that he did not expect, which means you are also an opportunity. Jason frowned, not sure. Like where this is going. Lion's smile was fleeting, but pointed. You are an outsider, Jason Ward, which means the rules that apply to Sylari do not necessarily apply to you. Jason narrowed his eyes, meaning you can ask questions others cannot. Lion said you can draw attention to things in a way that will not immediately be seen as an attack. You can plant doubt. Jason let out a dry laugh, running a hand through his hair. Right, so you want me to what? Stir up trouble, play the clueless human who just happens to poke holes in Vez's plans. Lion inclined their head. Essentially, Jason glanced at Sylari, expecting her to argue, but she was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. Fantastic love being used as a chess piece. Sylari finally spoke, her voice quieter than usual. You do not have to do this. Jason met her gaze, something unspoken passing between them, before he shrugged. Yeah, well, too late for that now. Lion's lips twitched again before they turned back to the display. Then let us begin planning. What followed was a crash course in intergalactic subterfuge. Jason had expected this meeting to be tense, but he hadn't expected to be thrown into full-fledged espionage strategy, mapping out exactly how to destabilize Vez's quiet takeover without exposing themselves in the process. Lion was meticulous and unnervingly composed, breaking down weaknesses in Vez's alliances, pointing out gaps in his influence, and most importantly, identifying ways Jason could leverage his exchange student status to ask questions that no one else could ask without suspicion. By the time they left, Jason's head was spinning with names, locations, and plans that felt entirely too complicated for someone who had come here just to study. Sylari was quiet as they walked back to their dorm, her posture stiff, her tail coiled tightly around her wrist. Jason finally sighed. Tell me what's on your mind, or am I supposed to guess? Sylari didn't immediately respond. The door slid open, and she stepped inside first, the lights adjusting to a soft glow as they entered. Jason dropped his bag near his bed, watching as she walked toward her side of the room with deliberate steps, her posture. You're still rigid. When she finally spoke, her voice was measured, but there was an edge beneath it. You pushed too far today. Jason frowned, crossing his arms. We needed to push. If we hadn't, VY would have walked out of there, thinking he still had complete control over the narrative. Sylari turned to face him, her silver gaze sharp. And now you've made yourself a problem he has to solve. Jason let out a humorless chuckle. News flash, Sylari was already a problem in his eyes. The second I stepped into this mess, she exhaled sharply, clearly frustrated. You don't understand how he works. You embarrassed him in front of people who matter. That won't go unnoticed. Jason met her gaze evenly. Good sailor's tale flicked, a flash of irritation passing over her expression. You don't get it. He won't just let this go. He will retaliate, and next time, it won't be through words in a council chamber. Jason felt a flicker of something dangerously close to anger at the implication. So what? We let him walk all over us, let him dictate how things go just because he might get upset if we fight back. Sailor's jaw tightened. It's not that simple, Jason scoffed. No, Sylari, it is. We either let him control the game, or we play to win. And I don't know about you, but I'm not interested in rolling over just because some entitled noble thinks he gets to decide who you are. Something flickered in her expression, something not quite irritation, not quite surprise, but something deeper, something more guarded. For a long moment, she didn't respond, simply watching him with that same unreadable intensity she always did when she was trying to decide how much to let him see. Finally, she let out a slow breath, her shoulders relaxing just slightly. You don't have to fight this battle, Jason. Jason shook his head. Yeah, I do. Sailor's tail curled, and for the briefest moment her silver eyes softened, but then she turned away, heading toward her bed. Get some rest. We'll need to be ready for whatever comes next. Jason didn't argue. He knew she wasn't telling him everything, not yet, but she wasn't pushing him away either, and that was enough. The retaliation came sooner than expected. Jason had been halfway through his xenal psychology lecture when his communicator buzzed with a priority alert. His gut clenched even before he saw the message exchange program infraction. Noticed the words were cold official, and when he opened the file, the accusations made his blood run hot. Unlawful disruption of administrative proceedings, violation of cultural preservation directives. unauthorized interference in interspecies governance. It was all nonsense. Fabricated charges designed to get him expelled. His heart pounded as he scanned the notification, his brain catching on one particularly damning line: recommendation for disciplinary action, pending review by the Intergalactic Academic Committee, immediate suspension of privileges until further notice. Jason barely heard the rest of the lecture. The moment class was dismissed, he was heading straight for the dorm, his thoughts racing. This was wise. It had to be. A council meeting wasn't enough. He wanted Jason out of the picture completely. And if this charge stuck, Jason wouldn't just be expelled, he'd be sent back to Earth. He didn't realize how tense he was until he stormed into the dorm and found Sylari already inside, standing near her desk, her own communicator in hand. She didn't look surprised to see him. If anything, she looked like she had been expecting this. "They're trying to kick me out," Jason said flatly, tossing his communicator onto the desk. Sylari glanced at the screen before exhaling, her tail flicking sharply. "I told you he wouldn't let it go." Jason ran a hand through his hair, his frustration boiling over. "Yeah, well, that's great and all, but I'd rather not have my year abroad cut short because some entitled prick doesn't like that." I called him out in public. Sylari's silver eyes darkened slightly, but when she spoke, her voice was measured. "Then we fight it." Jason let out a dry laugh. "Oh sure, I'll just explain to the academic committee that this is all political nonsense and hope they believe me." Sylari's gaze didn't waver. "You won't be explaining anything." She held up her communicator, a new document glowing on the screen. "We are." Jason narrowed his eyes. "What is that?" She met his gaze evenly. "Evidence." Jason took a step closer, scanning the file. It was a dossier on VES, his activities, his influence over certain faculty members, his involvement in rule enforcement manipulations. Nothing that was openly illegal, but enough to show a pattern of targeted actions against students he considered inconvenient. Jason let out a slow whistle. "You've been holding on to this." Sylari's lips pressed together slightly. It wasn't relevant before. Jason gave her a look, and now she tilted her head slightly. "Now it is." Jason exhaled, nodding. "All right, what's the plan?" Sylari tapped the file. "We take this to Lion. The silver thread has connections. We make sure this reaches the right people before VES can control the narrative." Jason smirked slightly. "So we flip the script." Sylari's lips twitched just barely. "We make sure it is written correctly." Jason met her gaze, a slow grin forming despite the situation. "I like the way you think." For the first time since the meeting, Sylari smiled just a little. It wasn't much, but it was enough. And as Jason followed her out of the dorm, he had the feeling this fight was only just beginning. Jason knew that the moment they handed over the evidence, there was no going back. This was the moment everything either fell apart or turned in their favor. He and Sylari walked through the dimly lit corridors beneath the university, moving swiftly toward the silver thread's hidden meeting chamber, the air around them thick with unspoken urgency. His communicator still displayed the official suspension notice, the cold, bureaucratic language staring back at him like a death sentence. He knew V's had orchestrated this, twisting the university's policies to frame him as a disruptive influence. And if he and Sylari didn't act fast, the committee would rubber stamp his expulsion before he even had a chance to speak. Sylari's pace was controlled but tense, her tail flicking behind her, and in sharp, irritated movements, she was doing that thing again, running through scenarios in her head, calculating every possible move. Before they even reached the door, Jason had come to recognize that as her way of dealing with stress, she didn't let emotions drive her. She analyzed, she controlled, she found solutions. When they reached the entrance, the seamless metallic door hissed open, and Lion was already waiting for them, their ever-shifting multi-tone voice calm as they gestured for them to step. Inside, the room was dimly lit by floating orbs of bioluminescent energy, casting an otherworldly glow across the walls, and the subtle hum of encrypted data being processed echoed softly in the background. "You're moving fast," Lion observed, tilting their head slightly. Their swirling eyes scanned the both of them before settling on Sylari. "Which means things have escalated." Jason dropped his communicator onto the table between them, the official notice glowing in stark contrast against the dark metal surface. "They're trying to kick me out," he said bluntly. "VES made his move. Lion barely glanced at the notice before looking at Sylari. And I assume you've come with something that will make that difficult for him. Sylari didn't waste time with small talk. She produced her own communicator, the encrypted dossier flickering into a projected display. Images, records, conversations, each one a piece of the puzzle that painted a very clear picture of Vez's manipulations, his influence, and his calculated efforts to remove perceived obstacles. "This is everything we have," Sylari said smoothly, her tone unreadable. "It won't be enough to bring him down completely, but it will force the committee to hesitate before pushing Jason out. They value their reputations more than their policies." Lion studied the information, their long fingers tapping idly against the table. "Impressive," they murmured, "but you're correct. This alone will not stop Wyatt. Will, however, make him realize that he has underestimated you." Their gaze flicked to Jason. "Both of you." Jason exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "So what happens now?" Lion smiled faintly, a slow, knowing curve of their lips. "Now we force the administration to acknowledge what they would rather ignore." They moved toward a sleek holographic console embedded in the wall, fingers moving with calculated precision as they began compiling the data into an official submission. Jason and Sylari watched in silence as lines of code streamed across the interface, the encrypted message formatting itself into something the university's oversight committee would be forced to acknowledge. Sylari crossed her arms, her silver eyes locked on the screen. "How long before they see it?" Lion's fingers paused for a fraction of a second before resuming their movements. "It will be in their system within the hour. Whether they choose to act on it immediately depends on how much pressure we apply." They turned to face Jason. "And that is where you come in." Jason narrowed his eyes. "What do you mean?" Lion gestured toward the notice of suspension still displayed on the table. "You have been accused. That means you have the right to a formal defense before the committee. If you demand an immediate hearing, they will be forced to address this evidence in public." Assumed those ties meant a certain expectation. Jason narrowed his eyes and arranged things. She nodded once in a way. "But I never agreed to it. My family." She hesitated, and for the first time, she looked almost uncertain. "Let's just say their priorities do not always align with my own." Jason watched her carefully, trying to piece together the missing parts of the puzzle. He had known there was something different about her, something that set her apart from the other students, but he hadn't realized how deep it ran. She wasn't just some random student here on an academic track. She was tied to something bigger, something political, something dangerous. And if VES was part of that world, then Jason was standing on the edge of something he probably had no business getting involved in. But the thing was, he was already involved, whether Sylari wanted to admit it or not. He exhaled, rubbing his temples. "So what happens now?" Wyatt didn't seem like the type to just let things go. Sailor's expression hardened. "He won't." Jason nodded slowly, letting the weight of that settle between them. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. And somehow he had the sinking feeling that things were only going to get worse. Jason didn't like feeling out of the loop. He had come to Vale and Prime expecting challenges, new cultures, strange technology, the occasional awkward interaction with B that didn't understand human customs, but he hadn't signed up for interstellar political drama. And yet here he was sitting across from Sylari, who had just casually dropped the fact that she had been part of some kind of arranged political alignment with an arrogant noble who seemed to think he still had a claim on her. Didn't sit right with him, but it wasn't his business. Or at least that's what he kept telling himself, except it was his business. Now VY had made sure of that. The guy had looked at Jason like he was an obstacle, like he was trespassing somewhere he didn't belong. That didn't feel like the reaction of someone who had given up on the idea of claiming Sylari, and judging by the way she had stiffened at his presence, Jason was willing to bet that VY wasn't the type to take no for an answer. Sylari was watching him now, her silver eyes unreadable, but there was something in the way she sat, not quite tense, not quite relaxed, like she was bracing for something, maybe for him to push the issue, maybe for him to demand more answers, maybe she expected him to back off. But Jason wasn't good at backing off when something didn't make sense, and this whole situation made absolutely no sense. Jason exhaled, rubbing his temples before finally speaking. "So let me get this straight. Your family wanted you to be with V's. Because of politics you didn't, and now he's decided that what he gets to act Like it's still on the table. Sailor's expression didn't change, but there was something tight in her voice when she answered. His family is powerful. Mine is powerful. That is how alliances are made. Jason frowned, narrowing his eyes. That's not an answer. Her tail twitched, curling around the leg of the chair, a nervous habit. He was beginning to recognize she wasn't as composed as she wanted him to think. She sighed, looking away for a moment before finally answering. VES and I were expected to form a bond. It was never something I wanted, but expectations are difficult to defy in our world. I came to Vale and Prime to escape that, to create distance between myself and the path my family set for me. But VES does not like to lose. Jason absorbed that, leaning back in his chair. So what happens now? Sylari was silent for a long moment before shaking her head. He will not make things easy. Jason scoffed, crossing his arms. Yeah, I got that much. So what's the plan? Are you just going to ignore him and hope he gets bored? Sailor's silver eyes flicked back to his sharp and assessing. That would be the logical approach. Jason snorted. Yeah, except he doesn't seem like a let-it-go kind of guy. Her gaze lingered on him for a beat too long before she finally looked away, her tail flicking again. You should stay out of this. Jason rolled his eyes. Oh sure, I'll just pretend the guy didn't walk into our room last night like he owned the place. That seems like a totally realistic option. Sylari exhaled through her nose, clearly frustrated. You are not part of this. Jason arched a brow. Tell that to VY. She didn't have an answer for that, and that more than anything told Jason exactly what he needed to know. He was already involved, whether she wanted to admit it or not. They didn't talk much after that, and Jason let it go for the moment, though he knew this wasn't over. The rest of the day was uneventful. If attending classes where half the students had extra limbs or communicated in bioelectric pulses could be considered uneventful, he tried to focus on his coursework, but his mind kept drifting back to Sylari, to the way she had carefully avoided answering certain questions, to the way her tail had curled when he pressed too hard. She was holding name either, and if there was one thing the academic elite valued above all else, it was the illusion of impartiality. If they refused to investigate now, it would look like they were protecting him. VY finally spoke, his tone carefully neutral. But Jason could hear the strain beneath it. I have nothing to hide. He turned toward the officials, his expression smooth. By all means, conduct your inquiry. It was a calculated move. He wasn't conceding defeat, but he knew he couldn't refuse outright. Jason watched him closely, knowing this wasn't over yet. But for the first time, it was VES who had control of the situation. The lead official nodded, voice carrying through the chamber. Then it is settled. A formal review of the charges against Jason Ward will be suspended until the inquiry into Lord Currow's actions is concluded. Jason exhaled, tension bleeding from his shoulders. They had won this round. He could feel it. VES had expected to silence him, to remove him before he became more of an obstacle. Instead, he had just made Jason's position even more visible, harder to erase without scrutiny. The meeting was dismissed soon after, and as Jason and Sylari walked out of the chamber, the weight of what had just happened settled between them. Students whispered in the hallway, some staring openly. Jason ignored them, his focus solely on Sylari, as they made their way back toward the upper levels of campus. After a long stretch of silence, Jason finally let out of breath and looked at her. That went better than expected. Sylari shot him a side glance, the faintest trace of amusement flickering in her silver eyes. It's not over. Jason smirked. No, but I'll take a temporary win. Sylari didn't argue, but her expression softened just a little, her usual guarded nature easing as they reached their dorm. For the first time since all of this had started, Jason could feel a shift between them. They had always been tangled in this complicated mess together, but now it was different. Now they were truly on the same side. They entered the dorm, the door sliding shut behind them, sealing them away from the whispers and the eyes that had followed them through the halls. Jason exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck, before finally turning to face her fully. So what happens now? Sylari hesitated for only a moment before answering. Now VES will try to contain the damage. His family won't let this inquiry drag his name down without a fight. But the fact that it's happening at all means he's already lost ground. If nothing else, it will make him hesitate before making another move. Jason nodded, considering That and what about you? Sylari tilted her head slightly, watching him with an intensity that made his breath catch just a little. What about me? Jason hesitated, then shrugged, keeping his voice casual, even though nothing about this felt casual anymore. You came here to get away from all that political nonsense, right? But it feels like you're always going to be tied to it no matter what you do. Sylari studied him for a long moment before finally sighing, her tail flicking slightly. Perhaps, but I'm not the same person who arrived here at the start of the year. Her silver eyes flickered with something almost contemplative. And neither are you, Jason smirked. Yeah, well, I didn't plan on spending my exchange year waging political warfare with a spoiled noble. Sailor's lips quirked slightly. No, but you did. He huffed out a small laugh before stepping closer, his usual joking bravado fading into something quieter, something real. So what now? Sylari's silver gaze met his, and for the first time there was no hesitation, no guarded walls, just something open and unspoken between them. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, she took a step closer, her tail uncurling from its usual place around her wrist and flicking gently against his side. Jason knew what that meant now. It wasn't just a reflex, it was a choice. He didn't overthink it. Instead, he leaned in slightly, just enough to close the distance between them. Sylari didn't pull away. If anything, her breath hitched just slightly, and for a brief moment, the carefully maintained distance between them vanished. But then, just as quickly, she pulled back, her silver eyes flickering with something almost amused. You realize, in-species relationships are still technically frowned upon here. Jason smirked. Yeah, since when have either of us cared about the rules? Sylari let out a soft, almost exasperated sigh, but she didn't argue. Instead, she just shook her head, her tail flicking around his wrist before pulling away again, lingering just enough to make his heart pound a little harder than it should. Jason grinned. Admit it, you're jealous every time Sylari talks to me. Sylari shot him an unimpressed look. If I were jealous, you would know, Jason chuckled, shaking his head as he flopped onto his bed, the weight of everything finally settling over him. He had come here expecting adventure. He had gotten more than he bargained for, but for once he wasn't looking for an escape plan. He